Good day, my name is John Snider. I'm with Anderson Engineering in Springfield, Missouri. I'm also a part-time faculty with MSU in Springfield, Missouri, the MSU Bears. Today we're going to talk about soil classification using the engineering method, which is also the basis for the military. So today we're going to learn about using these charts. Again, my name is John Snider with Anderson Engineering and also with MSU. This is part of TCM 326 for soil classification. The first chart we're going to learn about is this. This is table 5-2. It's out of FM 5410. If you wanted to download it online, you can get a PDF version. Basically, when we classify soils, we're going to look at whether it's coarse grained or whether it's fine grained. The first question is, do I have 50% or more that's coarse or 50% or more that's fine? And the definition of fine and coarse is what's called the number 200 sieve. The number 200 sieve is 0.075 millimeters in size. The difference between gravel and sand is 4.75 millimeters. So basically, when we look at these samples here on the left are gravels. We have a GW on the left, GP in the middle, GPGM and to the right. So when we look at our chart, that would be these samples on the left where it says G. Next, we'll look at the sands. Here's 3 samples, an SP, which is a coarse-grained SP, a fine-grained SP or sand, and then on the right is an SC or a clay sand. And these, again, what on the chart would be over here where we have an S. So basically, the first step is if I've got more than 50% above the 200 sieve, we'll go in coarse and we'll either classify them as gravels or sands. If we have more than half of the sample is passing the number 200 sieve, then it'll either be a fine grained soil, and that fine grained soil either have low plasticity or high plasticity. And in order to do that in the lab, we'll use an Atterberg limits chart, which is here you see now. If I'm below liquid limit 50, I'm a lean clay, a CL, or a silt, ML. If I'm above liquid limit 50, I'm either a fat clay, a CH, or a elastic silt, MH. So when we look at those soils, these are the soils here. Here we have an ML. It's a black soil. That's actually from City Utilities here in Springfield. They produce ash as a byproduct of coal combustion, but it acts engineering-wise as an ML. The soil in the middle is a natural ML or natural silt. The soil to the right, I have a bucket for it's an MH or elastic silt. They are very not ordinary, so we don't have a sample. If we get one, we'll go through that later. So these are the silts of low plasticity and high plasticity, and off to the right we have clays of low plasticity and high plasticity. The one in the middle is a lean clay. The one at the right is a fat clay, and the one in between is it's called a CLML, which is a silty clay, and its characteristics between the lean clay and a fat clay. The samples I have below in the buckets are samples we'll be using for field identification. We made 2-inch soil pats, or otherwise called cookies. We made some round balls about the size of a marble. We should have used about a 1-inch cube, but we'll just adjust from there and treat it like a cube. We may have to break the ball and get it into cube size, or break the cookies into cube size, sugar cube size, 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. The samples on the top are about 3/4 inch by 5 inch long. They're the cigar shaped, and we'll do our ribbon test for that. So those are for the silts. And these 3 samples are for our silty clay on the left, lean clay in the middle, and fat clay to the right. So again, we'll be classifying all the soil types. Our gravels on the top left, sands on the top right, our silts on the bottom left, and the clays on the bottom right. And according to this chart, that's where these stand here. We'll look at identify, does it have more sand and gravel, or does it have more silt and clay? If it has more sand and gravel, we'll go to this side and choose either gravel or sand. And then if it has more silt and clay, we'll go down this path, and we'll either classify them as low plasticity or high plasticity, and then whether it is more silt-like or clay-like to determine their classification. Here are some of the tools you'd like to take to the field if you could. We have 3 sieves right here. This is the number 4 sieve. That's the separate gravels on top and sands passing through. Then we have our number 40 sieve, which is what's used for the Atterberg. But anything above number 40 is coarse sand. Anything below that is a fine sand. Correction, that marks the boundary between medium size sand and fine grain. But if you look real closely, you can see through the number 40. You can't quite see the openings in this sieve, but they're basically the size of when you take a sugar and you look at those grains, that's about the size of these openings. So a number 40 sieve is also 0.425 millimeters, or 425 microns. The pencils that you use oftentimes are 0.5 millimeter, so basically just use your 0.5 millimeter pencil as a guide. Or think of sugar. If you think of salt, salt's actually a little bit bigger. It's about 1 millimeter. So think more like sugar. And this is the last one, the number 200 sieve. It's actually 75 microns, or 0.075 millimeter. No way you're going to see that. You can see through it. You can't hardly see the grains or the actual openings in the sieve. That's because the 200 sieve that's the finest sand. But by definition, the 200 sieve, you can't see those particles with the naked eye. So if they're sitting on top of the sieve, they're bigger than number 200. So they're actually probably passing through the number 100 sieves. So if you can see those grains with the naked eye, or even with reading glasses. So that you would call those sand size. If you can't see the grains, then they're going to be silts or clays. A couple other things you might want to use is some sedimentation jars. I made this. I just took a glass cylinder. I put in 10 grams of water, and I marked the 10, then did the 20 up to 100. Of course, I zeroed that or teared it off in the beginning so that it would be just the grams of water. 1 gram of water is equal to 1 milliliter cubed. So this comes very useful when I want to put sedimentation. I can fill the soil up to 100, fill the rest with water. The theory on sedimentation was when you shake it up and then you set it down, in 30 seconds to a minute, all the sand size particles will come out, and then I can use my ratio of 100 to whatever I have as a percent sand. I'll separate the gravel out beforehand. This is it's a plastic jar. Shouldn't cost you very much, so I'll fill that up to 100. Fill the water with soil, tamp it down a little bit, and then fill the rest up to 300. Shake it. 30 seconds to a minute later, I can tell how much sand is there. So that's another way to do gradation. Some other tools you might want to have with strength. We got a pocket penetrometer. We penetrate the soil. It penetrates the soil up to here, and then you'll read here the readings. These will be in tons per square foot. It's a little bit hard to see. But that says there's a 2.5. And you might have some plastic sandwich bags so you can take some samples. The official one is the military tins, but you could get plastic bags just about anywhere. Got a knife. Cutting, it could be a pocket knife. Spatula could be a pocket knife. Could use a scoop. Could use a shovel. This is about the size of an entrenching tool, but it could come in handy. Some water, or it could be a 1 liter plastic bottle. You might have your construction tape or a ruler. This will be useful for telling the millimeters. You know, I know that's about 4 millimeters, a little bit less than a 1/4 inch, but I could see it here also that, you know, 0.1 centimeter, so 1/2 millimeter or 1/2 centimeter is about 4.75 millimeters. You're gonna get dirty, so you need a rag, a wet rag, to keep your hands clean. And you might also need a rucksack or a backpack to put things in. These sieves, you can buy them also, or they come in much smaller sizes, so you don't need these large ones. So those are basic tools we'll be using. Here's the pocket penetrometer. You can see they're graduated at 0.25 tons per square foot, or TSF. So right here you can see the 2.0, 2.25, and then you can see the line just below 2.5, so that's 2.5 TSF. That'll tell you the strength of clay, plastic silt. The other tool that you should make sure to bring some Sharpies, permanent markers, red, black, blue, essentially to mark your plastic bags and other samples, but definitely bring a black one. So the first thing we're going to do is classify soils. The first question you have to ask is, do I have more sand and gravel, which is on this side, or do I have more silts and clays over here? So basically we use the 200 sieve. If more than half passes the 200 sieve, that means that more than half is fine grained. It's smaller soils. If less than 50% is passing the 200, which means more is above the 200 sieve, then it's coarse grained, which is the sands and gravel. So the first question, do I have more silts and clays, or do I have more sands and gravels? If I have more sands and gravels, do I have more gravel than sand, or do I have more sand than gravel? The definition between gravel and a sand is this right here, the 4.75 or number 4 sieve. So if I've got more of the largest particles, it'll be a gravel. So then the next question you're going to ask is the P200 or the fines, the smaller soil. Do I have less than 5%? Do I have 10%, or do I have 15%? If it's less than 5%, you're just going to look at the gradation to tell what it is, and it'll either be GW or GP. In reality, we don't have very many GWs, well-graded gravels. So almost always, if they're clean, you'll be a GP or poorly graded gravel. Here's an example of one. Now this soil here is fairly close to being a gravel. When I look at all these particles, I can tell, you know, this is close to 4.75 millimeters. There's not many particles below that. So do I have more sand and gravel? Do I have more silt and clays? Obviously I have more sand and gravel. Then in this sample, do I have more gravel, or do I have more sand? It's almost all gravel. There might be some sand-sized particles, but, you know, for example, this might be able to slip through a number 4 sieve. That might too, but so then I said, okay, I got more sand and gravel than I have silt and clay, so I'm coarse grained. Do I have more gravel than sand? I've got more gravel than I have sand. So then, how much fines do I have? This one right here, this finer material, that's the fines. The stuff that it'll sticks to your, coat your hand, that's fines. This doesn't have any fines. So there's going to be less than 5% fines here. So then is it well graded or poorly graded? Well, the nice thing about this one, this one does have a larger rocks, got a lot of different assorted rocks, so I have many different kinds. If they were all about equal, I had about 10% that would be 1 inch, 10% that's 3/4, 10% that's a 1/2 inch, you know, all in equal weights. This would be well graded. So I put this as a GW. Now if I actually sieved it, it may not be well graded, but it's close to it because we have large particles here. We've got next size particles, we've got smaller particles, we've got a good assortment. So it's close to being well graded, but in reality it probably doesn't classify. It's very difficult to get well graded materials because nature doesn't make it that way. Those are usually man-made. So I did call it GW, but we'd have to do the gradation and spread it out even more. So then here's another gravel. So these are all greater than number 4 sieve. Number 4 sieve is about 4 millimeters. This would be right on the number 4 sieve. But this soil would pass through. That's smaller than a number 4 sieve, or 4 millimeters. If I needed to, I could come take my ruler. I'll turn it upside down so the millimeters are on here. And so I know when I look at that, yeah, there's quite a few passing that would be smaller than 4.75. So when I look at it, I could put all the gravel to the side. That would be one technique. FM5410 talks about segregating this. So you could do that. In this case, it's so much, I can just visually imagine that. My guess is there's about 70% gravel sized particles like this. If I had to estimate, I'd estimate the sand size particles, and so you have to remember sand size is smaller than 4.75 millimeters, but it goes all the way down to the individual grains. Can I see them? I can see a lot of individual grains. So I'm going to guess maybe 70% gravel, 20% sand size particle, and maybe 5-10% silt. It may actually maybe 5%, so maybe 70%, 80% gravel, 20-25% sand, and then maybe 5% fines. When I've looked at it before, I thought there were 5% fines or less, so that's why I call it a GP. If it had 10%, we would call it GP-GM. But I think we did the sieve in the class, and the students got about 3-4% fines. So when you start washing this, it turns out to be more sandlite, and you can feel it. We'll do some tests on it, but it doesn't color my hand too dirty, so there's not a whole lot of fines in it. This one we called a GPGM. It's definitely gravel. When you set all these aside, the gravel size, and there's quite a few gravel pieces that, so my guess is there's probably close to 40-50% gravel size, maybe 40% sand size, but there's quite a few fines. You know, they stick to your hand. If you put them in the bucket, you can see there's lots of fines on the edge of the bucket. So my guess was at least 10% fine, so that's why I called it a GPGM, and there was more gravel than sand. Now you have to remember it's based on weight, so the gravel looks maybe equivalent to the sand, but these gravel pieces are all solid, so they weigh a fair amount. Plus I know that this was sold as a base stone, and by definition most base stones are GPGM, so that's why we classified it as GPGM. This was sold as a base stone also, but a cleaner base, so it was less than 5% fine, so we called it GP. So now we're going to go and look at do the same things, but this time we're going to look at material that we had more than 50% coarse, but we had more sand than we had gravel. We do the same procedure, look at the fines. If it's less than 5%, we call it clean. So it's a sand, and it's either well graded or poorly graded. In real life, there are not too many well graded sands, so If it's clean, it's almost always going to be poorly graded. Then we'll look if it's got more than 15% fines. It could be either SC or an SM, so it'll be sand, but it'll either be clay or silty. Same thing with the gravels. It could be a gravel, and if there's more than 15% fines, it could be silty or clay. By touch, when you've done this for a while, when it feels sticky, it's clay. When it feels not sticky or floury, it's a silt. But we will do some of the tests to show you the difference. So we'll look at SM or sand with silt, sand with clay, and that fine percent it's more sand than anything, but there's at least 15% fines. It's if it's in between, it'll be sand poorly graded with SM or SPSC. We don't have too many SW, so there's not likely to have an SSW SM or SWSC. The well-graded materials don't exist, so you won't find them unless they're man-made. So here we have the sands. This actually happens to be a coarse sand. All this material will pass the number 4 sieve, or at least about 60% of it will. So here's a number 4 sieve, 4.75 millimeters. So I'll just take a handful. So I put it on here. When we actually did the sieve, we ended up getting about 55-60% passing the sieve, and 40-45% on top. So this is actually right at the border. Some of this is material right on top of the number 4 sieve. Some passes just below. So this one's a difficult one to assess, but you have to use a sieve. So you might have called this a gravel. We would call it a fine gravel. You'd been close, but by sieving it, we would have got a coarse sand. So it would probably, you might have said coarse sand with maybe 40% fine gravel. So this would have been a tough one. This is a man-made material they got out of a river near Springfield. So that would have been tough to do. Here's a sand, fine grained. We can look at it. And most of the materials look about the size of my pencil, 1/2 millimeter pencil. So this would by definition be fine grained sand. It's all pretty much the same size. I do have some particles, but not enough where they would be represented in equal weight. So we would call this uniformly graded. It's all uniformly about 1/2 millimeter, a little bit less in size. There are a few 1 millimeter size, but because it's uniform, that means it's poorly graded. There's not many gradations, so it's poor in gradation. The next one we have is a clay sand. One thing when you do this, the first thing I feel is a slight stickiness to it. And when it stains my hands, you know, you can see the color because of the fines, the clay fines in there are able to stain my hand and keep them dark. If this was a SM or silty sand, this would have rubbed off. It's even hard time to getting it to rub out of my hands because it's sticky. But that's a silty sand. You can see the sand size particles. Again, they're about the same size as the sand we saw before, a little bit smaller, but so it's a fine sand, and this is a clay sand. So now we're going to do the fine grained classification. When you do this, again, the first thing you're doing is plasticity. Either it's a low plasticity or high. By definition, we'll do a lab test, and liquid limit 50 is what divides the high side and the low side. And if it's above this line or higher in PI, it'll either be CH or CL, but the clays are above the line. This line is called the A line. So above the A line would be our clays, below the A line is our silts, The M stands for Mahala. That's a city in Sweden. It's a glacial terrain, and that's when they found that, they probably named the silty soils that are found in front of glaciers as Mahala. That's where the M came from. So, and again, low if it's below liquid limit 50, H, or high if it's above liquid limit 50. And then there's a certain special soils that are right here between a PI or plasticity index of 4 to 7 and plotting in this range here. Those are called silty clays. They share some of the characteristics of a clay, some of the characteristics of a silt. You don't find them very often. The common application I see is topsoil. If you've got a real rich topsoil, oftentimes they may classify as a silty clay, but they're not very common. Just like the MHs are not very common. Usually you have to have, you see micaceous soils, or they've got little mica particles in that can make it MH, like in the Piedmont region around Atlanta, Georgia. I've seen those there when I was with Core Property Sciences or Atlanta Testing and Engineering. So we're going to go through those classifications, and we'll be able to classify it as a ML, CL, MH, CH. I will say most clays, it depends on your region, but it appears most of the clays, either lean clay or fat clay. Fat clay will be sticky, lean clay will be lean. That seems to be most of the world is those clays, because they had more chance to chemically weather to that. And if it's not one of those, the silt, they feel very floury. You'll know it when you feel it. They don't feel nearly as sticky, and they don't stick to your hand. They dry out very easily. And then if you might find MH, but if you're in that region, you probably know it already. So we'll continue on with those samples. So here we have coal ash that acts like a silt. This here is some soil in the area. You can feel it, but it has low plasticity. We'll do some tests on it, but one's a ribbon test. You can ribbon it. And it doesn't take much to, when you ribbon it, it just starts falling apart. That's a characteristic of a low plasticity silt. This is the fly ash. You know, if I didn't know the color, it would be hard for me to tell the difference between the two. But it has the same characteristics. I roll it, it just feels silty. It won't take much for it to start falling apart and just crumble. And then the other thing about the silts, I can rub my hand enough, and then the material, it's stained it black because of the coal, but it's pretty much gone. Let me try it with this silt here. I can rub it and it just disappears from my hands. That's a lean, low plasticity silt. The MH we don't have very much of again. We'll look at tests for lean clay and a fat clay. So the first thing I feel when I do this lean clay, it definitely feels, I can feel the plasticity in it. And you can mold it, which is the definition of plasticity. And then we have a fat clay over here. And the first thing when you feel it, I can just feel, it almost feels like glue, like a Yoo-hoo stick glue. It just sticks to my hands. That's one characteristic. So we'll look at the CH and do the test on the clays, and then we have a sample in between, which is a silty clay, and I can feel a little bit of sticky, so I know it's a clay, but it doesn't, it just feels weak. It doesn't have very much toughness, and when you roll it, you can roll it and it's starting to break apart, whereas the lean clays and fat clays won't do that. So now we'll do a sedimentation test. We'll take some of this clay. I know it's a sand, but if I didn't know, I'm gonna get about 100. I'll tamp it down a little bit because when it falls from water, it'll fall just under the water weight, so it'll settle fairly dense. So I got about 120 mils, so a little bit less. A little bit less, I got about 110. So that's pretty close to 100. So I'll go ahead and add water to it. Again, this might work better with the glass, but I'll be able to. I'll add it to about 300. So we'll shake it up and then we'll set it down. I'll shake it up for about 30 seconds to a minute. This is similar to a hydrometer test, but a field version. So I'm about 20 seconds into the settling. We'll give it another 5 seconds. So it's a little tough to see because this beaker is so old, but if you look real close, I can tell the sand is right here about, I got 50, 55, 60. I'm right at the 60 line. So in 30 seconds to a minute, my sand size particles fell out. So I started with 100. It's right here at 60. So that would say 60% of the sample was sand size, and then 40% was fine grained. And just from the murkiness of this water, that my instinct tells me that it's clayey fines, not silty fines. Usually the silty fines would be lighter in color and you might be able to see through it better. So the first step though in doing this, I did remove all there was no gravel to remove, but if I did, first step would be to remove any gravel size. So only the sand size, it'd be sands and then the fines. So in this case, we can say that they're 60% sand and 40% clay, which is about right. When I prepared these samples, I took a fine grained sand and took some clay that had been ground down to powder, and I proportioned it in about 60-40. So this sample does a pretty good test for being able to do this. One of the tests we're going to do is a cast test. The cast test is used by the Army in Field Manual 5-410. There's an app that West Point put together called the Soil Classification app, and here's some screenshots from it. But we're going to go ahead and try the cast test. But you wet some soil up, and the idea is if there's a lot of fines, the fines will hold the soil together. So when I make a cast here, I really can't even get it into a ball. We get it to be moist but not sticky. So I try to make it into a ball or cigar shape. I really can't, if I just put any handling at all, it just falls apart. So there are no fines in that. We could obviously try it with this, get it moist, but obviously there's not going to hold together. There's no fines to hold it together. However, if we do that test with our SC, just get it moist, it's able to hold itself together, withstand some moderate movement. So I know that it's not a clean sand, being an SP or SW. SW is not likely, but so it probably has to be an SM, or an SC, because I know it's sandy. There's no gravel in here, and I just by estimating I can tell that there was more sand than clay. And then from the sedimentation test we just did, we thought there was about 60% sand, 40% fines. So I know it has to be an SM or SC, and just by it sticks. It's the cast test tells me it's got fines in it too, besides the sedimentation. And then when I do the feel, I can feel there's some stickiness to it, and not the silty, powdery feel. And it dries out fast. If it was silty, clay just doesn't seem to dry out. It just keeps my hand, and it's still wet and moist. Whereas a silt, if I did this after 5-10 seconds, the powder would all disappear, and I'd be taking the dust off my hands, but there's still not dust, it's wet. We can also do the same cast test on this GPGM, so I'll just add a little water to it. So I'll do this part a little bit not without so much gravel, because the gravel won't hold itself together, but when I squeeze it, you know, there's a little bit of ability to withstand the cast, not much, but a little bit. So I know that there's some fines in here, and like I said, I thought there was 10%. If there were 15-20%, it'd be able to stick together just a little bit easier, but it withstands some handling, so that was an indication that it was 10% fines. And then, you know, I get rid of it, then I don't feel the stickiness like I did with that red sand. And then it's starting to dry out already, and my hand is fairly clean, so I know that those are silty fines. There's a little bit of clay feeling, but not nearly as much as the SC, so we call this a GPGM. This time we're going to try the sedimentation test on the GPGM. I'm going to use this jar. It should be a lot clearer and easier to see. Those again are marked at every 10 gram increment, so that 10 grams is 10 milliliters, so it's a good indication of volume. So we'll go ahead and try that now. I'm deviating from FM5 410. I've included the gravel in here, and we'll see how this performs. The gravel wasn't a huge amount, so I went ahead and included it in the sample. So we have 100 milliliters, and we'll go ahead and add water, shake, and let it sit for 30 seconds. So we got about another 5 seconds. We'll let it go. So what we can see, we started with about 100 before, and then we're right here about 90 right now. You can see it right here also. So about 90 grams have fallen out in 30 seconds. So we can estimate 90% of the sample, 90 out of the 100 grams is sand size particles or gravel size, and that 10% is still in the suspension. So we have coarse grained would be 90% and fine grained 10%, so that would put it 10% fine, so we were appropriate to call it GPGM. You can also see when it settles out, you can kind of see some of the coarser particles, but really at the top you can see it's getting smaller and smaller. That's the gradation where water put the biggest particles, had it fall first, and then the other particles. And you can see right here at the top, that's the silt size. So after 30 seconds to a minute, the next few minutes, maybe up to 5 minutes, you know, those are definitely silt size particles. The clay will take about, can take anywhere from 6 hours, 24 hours to come out of suspension, but we can already see that line here. So all those silt size particles have come out of suspension, and you can even see the water. The water is a much clearer than compared to the clay sample. So this would just affirm that these fines are silty fines. What I want to talk about now is moisture. When you classify soils and you first pick it up, we want you to note the moisture. ASTM talks about dry, moist, and wet, but most of the technician engineers I know can distinguish between dry, damp, moist, and wet. So here's the definitions. We'll go ahead and start. One of the samples, when you have dry, you can look at this sample and it just looks dry. First, mostly it loses the color. So, and I can see a lot of powder, and the sensation I have is dry. There's not really much moisture. So this sample right here would be dry. Now the same soil, when it's got moisture, is right here. So you can see it definitely has some color now. It's a kind of a yellowish brown. And when I feel this, I can feel the sensation. It's not dry, and I can feel some moisture to it, but it doesn't feel sticky. So this would be a damp soil. And here you can see the same soil when it lacks the color and it looks dull. So here's a soil, and we got the clays. I can grab onto it, and when the first thing I feel, hey, there is some moisture in it, but it's kind of a little bit, I feel moisture. So in this case I can feel the dampness. It doesn't have the same color like the gravel did, but I can feel some moisture. Definitely doesn't feel sticky. Now when I go to this sample, these are actually Proctor points. So that was dry of optimum here. And then I came to this sample. Not stick. I can feel more moisture. I can definitely feel it a little more, especially in these samples here. I can feel the moisture. So this might be moist, but when I go to the next sample, it's like, oh, I definitely feel the moisture. It colors my hands. It transfers the moisture to my fingers. So, and it's so easy to move it. This is definitely very moist. Just a little bit more moisture and it'd be wet, and I could see visible signs of water. Now the interesting thing for samples that are near optimum, one thing we can do is it should feel damp to moist. So this just feels damp to moist. It's not moist, it's not sticky, but it's not damp. It's not less than one clue for optimum moisture for your standard Proctor, which is D698. I should be able to take this, make a ball. I'm putting some effort into it, like a squeeze in a baseball, getting ready to make a pitch. And when I break it, you know, it breaks into a few particles. So that's a little bit above optimum. If it was way above optimum, I could come over here and I take these particles, make a ball about the size of a baseball, a little bit smaller. I try to break it, and it's not breaking into any particles. That's way too wet. So this one broke up into, I don't know, let's say 2, 3 major pieces and handful, 5, 6, 7 other. When we grab this one and squeeze it, it breaks up into too many pieces. So somewhere in between this and this is optimum moisture. Ideally it probably should have broke up into, oh, maybe something like that many pieces. That would have been optimum. So I'm having to break some of these myself because it's a little bit too wet. And so if you have soil samples in between, we could call this dry, damp. This would be moist, very moist. If we saw water on it, it'd be wet. And this one here is kind of a damp to moist. My guess is just maybe 1% above optimum moisture. Otherwise, for example, even on this, when I see this, you can see it's more granular. And when I feel it, it's not quite damp, but it's make a ball. It feels too dry. I would have called it maybe dry to damp, because when I make it, you can see it breaks up in even more particles than we had over here. So this is I would say dry to damp. I can feel a little bit of moisture, but it's just very dry. So we'll want to get our soil, if we were compacting, this is a fat clay, but we want to get it somewhere between this soil, just a little bit dry of optimum, a little bit of wet, or if you could blend the two. Again, we'd like to get the soil classified as dry, damp, moisture, wet. So dry, it'll look dry, you can't feel any moisture. That's pretty easy to do. Damp, you know, feel slight moisture, has some color, you can see it, but it's not sticky. Moist, it's just starting to feel sticky, and you can feel the moisture, but it's not wet. It's and definitely when it's wet, you can see the water often. It'll feel wet, so you want to be able to use those four classification. And again, for optimum moisture, you'll be calling it damp to moist, and so you'll be close, and that'll be good to get the optimum moisture for a standard proctor. If you're doing modified proctor like the Army does, you'll probably want to call the soil damp, because you'll learn about the proctor compactions, but the dry to damp for standard moisture and damp for modified proctor optimum moisture. So next we're going to try some of the crushing and ribbon test with the plastic fine grain material, the clays and the silts. There's a special soil that some of the silts are non-plastic. They act like sands, but they're not often found. So let's start out. We'll do some of the ribboning tests now. We'll go ahead and start with our fat clay. I've wrapped those up, and we'll take those out of the plastic. So when you get to the site and you come in your truck or your Humvee, you'll want to grab some soil. So yesterday I made these pats. I got the soil damp, and I got it to moist, so it wasn't quite sticky. So it was about damp to moist, not quite sticky. And I made some cookies about 2 inches in diameter, 1/2 inch thick. If I was in the field, the first thing I'd do is I put it on the Humvee, hood of the Humvee or hood of the truck, to get it to start to dry out. You don't want to put it in an oven. These are all air dried. And then I happened to make these yesterday. It's kind of cigar shaped. That's why they got some moisture when they got covered with plastic. That's another indication. This is a fat clay. There's so much moisture just in the plastic that you can see the moisture at the surface. When you cut it, it'll look just like the same thing. You'll see this shiny, almost glass-like surface. This is a lean clay. When I take it out, you won't see nearly the same moisture. The clay is fat because it's fat, or fat in moisture. So you can see a little bit of moisture, but not the same amount as with the fat clay. So we'll go ahead and take this. This is called the kind of the ribboning test. You just start squeezing this to about 1/4 inch. Fat clays have a unique, they have very high plasticity. You have to just be careful. I'm going to just go squeeze, and it should be able to hold its weight. So you can just see it's barely, so it's about a 5-6 inches. A true fat clay can go about 8 inches, but this does classify as a fat clay. So we got about, I'd say about 5 inches. So the textbook for FM5 410 calls it 8 inches or more. But having done the plasticity on this, we got a liquid limit of about 70. So just from experience around here, you know, let's say 4 or 5 inches to 8 inches is definitely fat clay. So this will require judgment. But again, this is about a liquid limit 70. You just have to be real careful. Maybe if I was a little bit careful, I could have got it to go more. I wasn't able to take out all the fine material. I didn't quite get just the number 40 or smaller. But so this is about a 5 or 6 inch, and it kind of holds. So maybe I just handle a little bit. I might have been able to get maybe 6 inches on that. That's an indication. This one we've done in the lab, we know it's a lean clay. So yeah, so it didn't quite get maybe an inch and a half before it broke and fell off under its own. Yeah, couldn't. So same thing, maybe a little bit more here, 2 inches. So an inch or two, yes, that's a lean clay. In the case right here, 5, 6 inches. We got fat clay. I think this is a silty clay. I don't know if it's a silty clay, a true CLML, but it may be just a low plasticity silt. One thing I feel, as soon as I feel it, I can feel sand, grit. If you can feel the sand, there's probably at least 15%, maybe 30% sand in there. So yeah, it broke off too, so it's maybe about an inch. Yeah, so it broke off too. So its size is a little bit, we're a little bit smaller than the, a little less than an inch. So that's an indication that definitely not a CH. I think this is approaching a CLML, but I believe it's probably the low plasticity CL. So this one having lower plasticity than this sample, but not considerably. So now I'm going to go to what I think is the silts, and again, they're hard to find, not as common as the clays, but if you're in this area, an area you'll know. And so the best thing is to ask the locals, whoever's there. If you're in the United States, somebody will know, or you can pull up a soil survey from the USDA, the NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service. They got a web soil survey, WSS. You can find out what you're going to get before you even get there. Overseas, you need to do your research. So it's barely holding now, but yeah. So it, again, about an inch. This one didn't hold but ½ inch. So a little less plasticity than what I thought the CLML or low CL plasticity was, but feeling wise it does feel a lot less plastic. So I can't quite get too far. And even the sample itself, it's cracking before I even got so not very far. What I thought was ML for the ash, the engineering properties of ML, but the source is obviously man-made. I just broke that without even taking it off. We'll go ahead and try. I got one, and it broke before I even got the second one. So not much plasticity. So it's definitely low plasticity, an inch or less than an inch. So in that sense, it's right. No, about an inch on those. So we'll go ahead and do, they kind of show the same thing. We'll go ahead and do the pats now. Fat clays, when you do these, they shouldn't be able to break in half. They're so hard. We'll go ahead and try to break it. And I am pressing down hard as I can. I cannot break it. And this one I made a little thinner, thinking I might be able to break it, but I can't. I can't break it. And I put as much effort as I could. They will not break. They're so fat with water, when they dry out, they just suck the clay particles together. So even mud, when it gets dry, it can become hard, but they become very, very hard. So there's a little bit bigger pat. I'm able to break it in half. This one was a little thicker. You got to be careful. We probably should have made the pats a little bit thinner, more like a 1/4 inch, not half an inch. I may have to do some assisting here. See if I can break a smaller piece. I think it's just a bit too thick. Well, there I was able to break it because I had the right angle. And so it breaks, but with some moderate effort. Here I can feel the sand on this too. It just very feels like sandpaper, kind of like number 100 grit. 100 grit sandpaper is the sand that's on top of the number 100 sieve, so it feels just like it says. We'll get a little thinner one, see if we can break it. So this has got some more strength to it. I don't know if I did it too thick, but this actually may be lower in plasticity than I thought was here. So this it feels different when the strength. We'll just break it in half so I can get it. I can't break it there, so there may be a little bit more plasticity. I can break it to smaller pieces. So those have I think I've got these two backwards. Now we have our what I called ML. So yeah, it broke pretty easy. I would harder than a like a Nabisco cracker, but not much harder. It broke pretty easily. Just a little bit of effort. That was about the same as a cookie. So a little bit of maybe a dry cookie that had been sitting out 2-3 days. A little bit of effort, but not much. Here's our ML. So we'll go ahead and get about the same size, and it broke even easier. So it doesn't have nearly the strength, the plasticity is this. So lowest plasticity, a little bit higher, but definitely low. That was easy to break here. Easy to just a little bit. I think I got these backwards. This was the next highest, and then this one here being a little tougher, and then our fat clay. So I think what I called CLML, it felt that way when it was wet, so that's how you can be deceived. So now we'll go to the crushing strength test. So it's similar to the breaking, but we'll try to crush it. So I'm gonna have to crush these because I need a small enough piece. Ideally, you'd get a piece about the size of a sugar cube. I made round balls. These are going to be way too hard to break, but a piece like that I might be able to crush if it was just a normal lean clay. But even this small piece, I cannot crush something that would be the size of a sugar cube. There's no way. Even a smaller size, well, I could break that one in half, but it was very tiny. So now we'll try the same crushing. I've already broke this last time, so I'll take something about the size of, a sugar cube would be somewhere a little bit bigger than that, but that's all I have. So I can crush that with my hand, moderate, about the moderate level that I took to break it, so I can break it. So kind of moderate level to break and crush those. One thing you can do if you come to the site and you don't have enough time to make these, you can find a little dirt clod, and it won't take as much effort normally because it's usually been ripped up and everything, but sometimes they're very similar in strength. We'll try this one here. So that might be half of a sugar cube, and so it's hard. It took a moderate a hard amount of effort. That this was harder than this. So just like with the cookie test, it took more effort to break this than this. So when I call this a lean clay, low plasticity, this actually should be a lean clay with probably low to moderate plasticity. When it's wet, it doesn't quite feel that. So I've been doing this 30 years, and you can be deceived. So use all the clues you have. Here's another one. So this would be about the size of a sugar cube. So if I could break it, I just put my thumb on it and I just crush it down straight flat. There's nothing resisting. Maybe about the same effort that it would take to crush a sugar cube. It's just very low. So that proves it's a lean clay. I'll take this. This is about the size of a sugar cube, and it was even easier. So it has the lowest plasticity. So those are the tests we have. We'll do the latency test next. Hello. We're going to go ahead and do the latency test now. So if you kind of get in right here, we'll see this. Again, this was our what we thought was a silt. So right now it's dry, damp, moist, wet. Definitely not dry. I can see some color. It's not wet. You don't see any moisture. So it's either damp or wet, or damp or moist. And I'd say it's damp. So we'll get a little bit of moisture in it to make a pat. So it's just wet, but not quite sticky. Yeah, I can feel the moisture in here. So let's just go a little bit more. And when I put the water in, I could see the water didn't go in too quickly. So this actually may be more like a, so you can see the water just ponds on it. If it was a silt, it probably would seep in, but we'll go ahead and get it mixed in. So I got it in my pad. Now I'm going to strike my hand. And I can see a little bit of water come up, so it's a little bit of dilatancy, but not a whole bunch. And then when I remold it, any water that was there disappeared. So again, I can see a little bit of the water come up, but as soon as I remold it, the water goes back into the soil. So this is probably, this may not be a silt, this may be more like a lean clay, but it was the closest to the silt that I could get. So that's the latency test. And then when you roll it, it feels very weak. So I know that's low plasticity. The next test we'll do is the lean clay. So we'll come here. And again, dry, damp, moist, wet. Definitely not dry. I can see the moisture. I can feel it. It's not wet. There's no freestanding water. It's either damp or moist, and we're somewhere in between. It's probably more like the damp. So I'm going to add water. Make a pat. Any of the gravel-sized particles I'll take out. So it is now definitely moist, not wet. I don't see free water. I think I need to add a little bit of water. And just like before, it doesn't go in. Actually, this time it actually ran off, and it doesn't even want to go into the soil. So I know it has more plasticity. So it's definitely moist, so I'll go ahead and strike it. And I don't really see any water, maybe a little bit, but less than before. So no reaction. So there's a none or very, very slight. Now we'll grab our fat clay. If I grab the fat clay, again, dry, damp, moist, wet. It's not dry. I see the color in it. It doesn't feel wet, and I don't see moisture. So somewhere between damp and moist. This will have to work in because I know it's a fat clay, so it takes a lot of kneading to get the moisture into the clay. But now it definitely feels moist. Put a little bit more just to, and it's really sticky. It feels almost like glue, like a Yoo-hoo glue all over your hands. You can see the water's just ponding on like a, so this would make good pond liner or landfill liner material, because it just stayed on the water, stayed on the top, wouldn't even go in. So it's definitely moist, and there should be no reaction at all. Yeah, and the water doesn't even come out, not even any indications of water coming out. There's none, so there's no reaction, and as you would expect with the fat clay. We'll do our last sample, which is the sample from City Utilities. We'll see if we get any reaction, and we should, because this was the least plastic one we had. So we'll take some sample. Again, dry, damp, moist, wet. Not dry, I can see the color. It's not wet. This actually may be closer to moist. And then when I put the water, you can see the water almost disappears into the soil because it should give some latency on this. So I'll work it in, get a little bit more soil. So again, when I put it in, it just disappears into the soil, so it should be able to dilate when I hit it. The dilation is basically you're rearranging the particles and causing the water to come out. So it's moist, and you can see the waters come up to the surface here, so it's dilated, and then when I rearrange it, the water disappears. So that's the latency. So this is definitely the ML. It's a fairly quick reaction. The water came up. They call this I call it like fresh meat, or if you take liver and you cut it, it's got that wet appearance. That's almost what they call livery, kind of a wet sheen on the surface. So that's a dilatancy, and then when you rearrange it, it disappears. So this one dilates. This one did not, so it's a silt, but it may be closer to a CL. And then as we went farther and farther, more plastic, we got maybe a little reaction with our lean clay, but we definitely got no reaction with our fat clay. So we'll start and we'll do the last set of tests and wrap it up. Just hit the button. Now we're going to do the ribbon test. I've taken soil and prepared them all about the same moisture, so they feel damp to moist. It's not dry, it's not wet, I don't see any standing water, but it feels moisture, but a little bit more. It's slightly sticky. Sticky would be moist, so I'm kind of right at the damp to moist. This is our fat clay that we're testing, and so when I start squeezing it, the first thing I notice is this takes some effort. I am putting some effort, and my hand is actually a little sore. I did it for maybe 2-3 minutes to get it at the right moisture, and it is hard. My hand is tired. And then the other thing is, I don't know if you can see when I'm ribboning this, you can see how shiny it is. That's that shine that I talked about earlier. You can get it's almost glass-like. So when you make a cut into the soil, or you do a ribbon like this, you can make a shiny appearance. So that's the fatness, or the water. It's so fat with water. There's a ton of water available, but it feels tough when I'm doing this now, and it takes some effort. And I'm not even near the plastic limit. By definition, if you take like this, you make a little, I'm pressing about the same pressure that I would put if I wanted to massage my eyelids or eye. I'm not putting a lot of pressure, but I'm just putting enough. So I'm rolling it, and I'm rolling it, and I'm rolling it. I got too much, so let me go a little smaller. And so even though it has moisture, this is way smaller than 1/8 of an inch. By definition, if it would break at 1/8 of an inch. So this is kind of a form of the plastic limit test, but I'm able to make this tiny. And it's still damp to moist near optimum, but it has so much plasticity, it's able to make a very, very fine. So if I kept making this drier and drier, and it was near the plastic limit, the reason it can keep it such a tiny roll is it's got so much water in it still, but every time I roll it, you can see the moisture is kind of making its way onto the concrete. And so it would dry out, but if I got it to where it was cracking 1/8 of an inch, that soil would be very hard or very tough. It takes a lot of effort so tough, like in strength. So this is what I thought was the lean clay. So it's still not dry, it's not wet, yeah, damp, but it feels moist, but not sticky moist, so just slightly. So it's same moisture, it's probably near optimum. You can see how it cracks when I'm this has the ability to crack. The other one, and it doesn't feel nearly as hard. It's much easier to and even the more I move it, just in a few ribbons, within 10-15 seconds, it's already starting to crack because the moisture is coming out onto my hand. Every time I deal with it, the moisture is bleeding out on my hands. You can see right there, it already started to break, and it didn't take much effort. So I'm going to make it into a little, so I have to be very gentle, get it into, and you can see it's already starting to break. Now this is the one that I may have broken because I didn't quite, but it's starting to, it's near its plastic limit. It's much smaller than 1/8 here, so I'd have to assemble this. It'd be easier with 2 hands, but be very gentle. Just pull it together, get it uniform in moisture, make it into a little bit of a circular, then find some pieces that can roll. And they're starting to break, so this is a little bit wetter than the plastic limit, but the big thing I feel, it's near the plastic limit, but it's not nearly tough. It's a low to medium toughness. I can still ribbon it, so it definitely is fine grained. It's got the ability to be ribboned. The other thing is I keep working it. It won't take very long. Just by working it here, it's starting to lose its moisture and starting to crumble. So it didn't take very long, whereas I could keep doing the fat clay. Oh, that's much harder. It would take me a long time to get rid of this moisture. It's so fat, it's got such an affinity or likeness for water, it would take forever to get this out, maybe 5-10 minutes, or this just took a minute or two. So now we'll go to our, what I thought was a ML or silt, but it's probably a low plasticity clay. The thing I noticed, first thing, it's the easiest one so far to, it just feels almost like a putty. It's easy to move and squeeze, almost like your toothpaste. A little bit more tough than that. So is it dry? No, it's got color. Not wet, I don't see any moisture. It does feel a little bit damp, a little bit more than damp, but it's not sticky, it's just slightly sticky. So I can keep moving. Definitely easy. It doesn't offer much resistance, or doesn't have much toughness. So I'm just going to keep playing with it. So one thing you do, you can get on the site if you're a consultant like myself, you pick up some soil right from the start. Talk to the contractor, talk to the owner, and what I'm doing is I'm just working this in my hand while I'm talking to them. Just keep working, and within a minute I'll know what this feels like, because I can tell if it's fat and wet. It starts shiny like my CH. I can tell, hey, this is fat clay right from the start. If it feels less, it could be a lean clay like this, or in this case even leaner. The only problem with this soil, it's so lean that it's very sensitive to water. So if it get good weather, windy, or get rains, water will come in and come out very easily. So it's very sensitive to water. So we'll try a little smaller piece to see if I can work the water out of this. So it definitely can ribbon, so we know it's fine grained. Another indication. So they're not really crumbling. I'm actually probably putting too much force, so they're coming apart because I'm just tearing it. But if I can get a little one going, yeah, it's still got, it's above the plastic limit. It's near. You can see the moisture's come out onto the concrete. Ideally you do this officially with frosted glass, but if you don't have that, you can use a paper, sheet of paper to pull the water out. It provides a smooth surface, but it also will pull water out. You could use the top of the Humvee, you could use the top of your truck also. It'll give a little heat. So very gentle, just getting it to go back and forth. So it's holding together, but I think I'm getting a little bit less than an eighth before it's starting to break, and it's not really crumbling, but it's getting close. So that only took 2 times. If I work it a little bit and try one more time, it might happen on the 3rd time. It still feels weak. I don't feel the hardness like I did with the fat clay. It's nothing to feel soft, not tough at all. So we'll get it going in a ball. Some smaller pieces. Very gentle, and it's starting to break right at an 1/8 of an inch. So these other ones are close. If I just the act of rolling it will pull some moisture out and cause it to start to break. But the bottom line, when I feel this moisture, its toughness is very low, and it's it doesn't have much toughness. So next, we'll do the last one. We'll do our silt. So I've got it. Again, it's not dry. Doesn't feel wet. I don't see any standing water, but it's somewhere between damp and moist, slightly sticky. And just, you can see a lot of the moisture coming off on my hands. That's the coal residue, but it's moisture that you're actually seeing. It colors it. So I've just done it a little bit. So I'm pulling quite a bit of moisture out. This was the one that was most dilatant. So the water can come into the soil very quickly, but also leave very quickly. So this will be the hardest one to roll into a ball, onto a shape. So it's even trying to get this, like, even as gentle as I'm having a hard time of even rolling it. There, I get some a little bit going, but it's not very easy. So I can roll it, but it's at the lower end of the ability to roll. So it would be at this is definitely a silt. And so not much kneading caused it to lose enough moisture, even though it started about the same damp to moist condition like the other samples, but it just very difficult to get it. I'd have to be real gentle and I could probably get it, but so it took a matter of seconds to get like that, whereas this took, a minute or 2 minutes. This was 3, 4, 5 minutes, and this would take for tens of minutes. I couldn't even get close. So that's the roll test. So that completes the test. So to summarize, we learned about soil classification. This is modified from the ASTM for the visual manual method, the ASTM D2488. I didn't use it exclusively, just as a guide, and also used the manual out of FM 5410. The Corps of Engineers developed the classification system first, so that's why the military method and the ASTM, which is based off the USCS, are very similar. So we have the gravels we've looked at. So we had more of a well-graded gravel on the left. It's got a lot of different sizes. We don't have much fines, less than 5% fines over here. Definitely more sand and gravel than silt and clay. You got more gravel than sand, and then we don't have hardly any fines, so this would be a gravel. But the next question would be, is it well graded or poorly graded? You've got lots of different rock, larger rocks, smaller, so it's closer to well graded. We'd have to sieve it to actually tell. We then went to the GP. It was more sand and gravel, more gravel than sand. It had a little bit of fines in it, but not a whole lot. And then we did the GPGM. So that's the one we did the sedimentation test. At first glance, it looks like maybe there's half gravel, half sand, but if you set it aside, you'll see that you got a little bit more gravel than sand. And then just by feel, it looked like 10% fines, but we did the sedimentation test and we saw that we had 90 grams out of the 100 grams, or 90 milliliters out of the 100 milliliters settle out in 30 seconds, so that would indicate the 10% fines. And then we saw that most of the fines actually settle out within maybe another 30 to 130 seconds to a minute, indicating they're more likely to be silt size. The clay takes the longest, you know, anywhere from 12 to 16 hours to settle out, 24 hours. So that confirms the GM. Again, the first particles to settle out would be the gravels, obviously, then sands, 30 seconds. The silts, maybe you know, the coarser silts in a few minutes, and then up to maybe 12 hours or so to get to the clay size particles, and 12 to 24 to finish out the clays. They take a long time because they're so flat. Here's our sands. This sample on the left was a sand, but it's half sand, half gravel, so fine gravel to, so number 4 gravel type, and then the material passing number 4. It's clean, there's no fines in it, so that's why we call it SP. We just had a little bit more sand went through than the gravel when we did the actual sieve analysis. Next one was a SP fine. It was all fine grained, no fines appreciable. We tried the cast test. It can hold together, but just barely. When you moved it, it fell apart. Here we had our SC. We did the sedimentation test and got about 60% to fall out in 30 seconds, so that indicated the sand. You can see when you first look at it, you just see more sand sized grains everywhere than you see the clay, but most sand is not red. It's red because of the iron staining normally from your clay, so that was an indication. But when you did the ball test, we know that definitely there was enough fines in it, and when we did the sedimentation, got about 40% fines or silt and clay. But the big thing when we did the sedimentation test, there wasn't much silt sized particles that fell out. It was just went from straight sand to real murky red. And part of that I know is because I assembled the two. I used a fine sand and mixed it with a clay, a powdered clay, so it performed very well. Then so that, looking at our chart, we've just finished the left side of the chart where we did we used the number 200 sieve. Do we have more sands and gravel? So then we looked at the gravels and sand, and we used 5% passing fines, and those were clean sands or well graded, poorly graded. We don't have well graded normally in nature, so most time it'd be gravel, poorly graded. If we had 15% or more, it would either be a GC or GM. The clays feel sticky, the silt doesn't. In between we'd have an intermediate, so it follows it. And with it's the same procedure with the sands. So now we'll talk about the silts and clays. We're looking at high plasticity, above 50 liquid limit, low is below the liquid limit of 50. We do that based on toughness and breaking and things like that. So when we did that, we ended up doing these tests where we looked at the samples. The fat clay on the right was very tough. It didn't dilate. We were able to ribbon it very small, and it was very tough when we moved it. When we did the ribbon test, we got the longest samples. The lean clay that we did next, you know, was able to we only got an inch out of the ribbon test. We were able to break it with moderate pressure. The fat clay over here took, you know, we weren't able to break. We were able to break it with a hammer. I was able to crush sugar cube size, but only with great difficulty, and I couldn't do it on some. When we did the lean clay, we were able to break it with some moderate effort and also crush it with moderate effort. When we came to what I thought was a silt, but it's probably a low plasticity clay, it took a little less effort to break, more like a cookie breaking, a dry stale cookie. I was able to crush it with even easier effort than the lean clay. And when we did the ribbon test, it took even less effort, similar to the lean clay, but less, so lower plasticity. It was able to roll fairly easy. And the least amount was our ML, that was a not natural, man-made, but it we were able to get some dilatancy out of it. It didn't ribbon very long. It was the smallest one. Very easy to break the cookie or do the dry crushing strength, it went very, very easy. And again, the plastic roll test was the easiest to do. So again, this is how you classify soils according to ASTM visual manual method D2488, or using the FM5410 method. We were able to look at these soil samples from gravels to sands, the silts to clays, lean clay, fat clay. We did these various tests, and by doing that we were able to follow the FM5410 chart for soil classification. Again, my name is John Snider. I'm with the Anderson Engineering out of Springfield, Missouri. I'm also a per course faculty with MSU in the construction management department, doing this for TCM 326. If you have time, I'll also look at FM5410, and you can tell on page 526 there's a figure for how to do this. The military's kind of broken it down a little bit differently. Both these charts we looked at are their charts. This just does it a little more step by step, so that even without any basic knowledge, you could probably get to the end, or give the information that an engineer, a licensed engineer like myself, a professional civil engineer or professional geotechnical engineer could use. If you can get it to this texture or this classification versus this classification versus this, each one of these boxes has or circles has different engineering properties, and we'll be able to estimate for preliminary hasty purposes what design parameters you need to follow. Again, figure 5.7, and then over here this is table 5.2. Again, this is John Snider with Anderson Engineering and MSU. Go Springfield Bears. We are Anderson Engineering. We strive to be the best company to work for, best company to work with. Thank you.